I need someone to show me my place in all this.
Nothing will stand in our way.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I will finish what you started.
Who are you?
I'm no one. There are stories about what happened.
It's true. All of it.
The Force. It's calling to you.
May the Force be with us.
My nerd world.
Just let it in.
Ojaba. Why does she get a blaster and I don't? Ojaba.
I was listening to the Steel Wars podcast today. Went for a bike ride. I'll get to my apologies for being late on the show this week. I have a reason. Not a good reason, but I have a reason. Listening to the Steel Wars podcast. Had a chat with Sal Morales on there, and one of the girls from Rebel Girls, and had people calling in. It was good. Enjoyed it. Took up my entire 50-minute ride, and there's a couple things actually from the show that two things specifically. We'll address the first thing now, and we'll get to the other item a little bit later on. But Steele, who I appreciate quite a bit, I really like his approach. He's very bipartisan. He's very fair, and I really appreciate that. And unlike a lot of podcasts, and even some shows that he's been on, I find that I genuinely can hear his love of Star Wars. Oftentimes I'll hear these shows that give out a lot of great information, but for whatever reason, I don't sense a lot of just genuine love for the movies. And I definitely get that from Steele. And Steele made a really interesting comment towards the end of this week's show, and he said, Star Wars has done all right by us. Star Wars has been pretty good to us. It's provided us a lot of joy. And it got me thinking, because one of the, if not the focus of this week's show is going to be sort of the essence of Star Wars. I'm going back to Rian Johnson and what he said in that interview with the Kasdans about his trilogy, which we're going to talk a little bit about, and getting to, do something new in a place where people haven't been with brand new characters, and what is the essence of Star Wars. And that's a tough thing, and we'll get into a little bit more detail of this later on in the show. It's a tough thing to zero down to, right? Because I think it means something different for a lot of different people. But, I think Steele, without even realizing he was doing it, kind of hit the nail on the head. It's just joy. Star Wars brings you joy. And that to me is, and that's why the Force Awakens worked with what J.J. Abrams did with Lawrence Kasdan, in that they wanted a story that was going to delight. I actually jotted down just episode 7 and 8, right? You can go through all the movies, but just episode 7 and 8, and some of the moments in those films that always bring me pure joy. And this sounds ridiculous, right? All things being relative, I struggle with, if I'm going to watch a movie I've already seen before, if I'm not watching something brand new, I want to go and watch Star Wars. And I struggle with, I'm watching Star Wars too much, right? Because it brings me the most joy out of all the older movies that I've seen, and I've been in such a Star Wars place and mood. I made a comment to somebody the other day, and that was, actually, I'll tell you where it was. You'll be able to hear it, and I'll tell you this, because I was on another podcast this week that drops, so you're going to get a double dose if you want to hear more of me go blah 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 about a galaxy far, far away. But I would watch The Last Jedi more often than I do if I didn't mind the eye rolls that I get from my wife. She doesn't care But she does walk in the room and kind of roll her eyes and go, "You're watching Star Wars again? You're watching The Last Jedi again?" Now, granted, I could go and say the same thing about her as she watches, past episodes of and seasons of Survivor on Amazon. But be that as it may, and look, the reality is, if I want to watch The Last Jedi, I watch The Last Jedi. I do try to put some distance between it because I do enjoy the movie so much that I'd like to wait for the right moment, especially when I have a chance to sit down and watch the whole thing in one sitting. I just realized that I haven't gone and made this official yet.
My Nerd World.
Welcome to episode 128 of the My Nerd World, a Star Wars podcast. I am your host, Jon Justice. Show is out a little bit late this week, and that is because I've been expecting some news to drop. I don't know what it is. I have my theories, which I'll share with you. But Twitter's been weird this week. There's been a lot of cryptic tweets from a lot of different individuals, and it appears that there is some news that's out there somewhere that people have that they are not sharing. And I know this specifically because Steele Saunders mentions this on his podcast, and Jason over Making Star Wars knows what it is. And there's been several people close to Disney and Lucasfilm who have tweeted some cryptic tweets, and so this has sparked people's interest. And I was kind of waiting as long as I could this week to get a show out because I wanted to be able to talk about whatever it is. Truth be told, if it drops, I'll record another show this week to cover it, depending on how big the news is. Now, Steele did on his pod a pretty big hint, and I think I've got a pretty good idea of a theory on what it could be based off that hint. So I'll share that with you. We will get into sort of what's the essence of Star Wars and what it means for the original trilogy movie-going audience like myself, and what it means for the newer generation, those that were introduced to Star Wars for the first time through the prequels, and everybody, from there on out, okay? Because I think it's going to mean different things for different generations. And I do have several news items to get to, and a couple things that we will talk about. And within the news items, the last one we're going to talk about in the news items is this rumor and a comment that Steele said on his podcast, and sort of deducing his statement on how the fandom would react based off of this rumor. There's also been some rumors that have been floating around on Reddit that are pretty interesting that we'll talk just briefly about. I don't think they quite work. I do find them fascinating. I think there are ways to make them work depending on the time jump. These are episode 9 rumors, depending on the time jump between episode 8 and 9. But they involve some rumors floating around this week, and I'll come right out and say it. There's some rumors that were floating around earlier this week that a toddler, like a 4-year-old, was being cast for episode 9, and that this 4-year-old potentially would be like a Reylo baby, okay? And then some people were speculating that maybe the Force touch in The Last Jedi transferred midichlorians and sort of almost immaculate conception to Rey, and she had the baby between the two films. Look, if JJ was going to go and round out the saga and actually had the huevos to bring midichlorians back into the mix, that'd be pretty brave in my opinion. And we will talk a little bit about midichlorians because George Lucas made some comments about what he would have done with his Star Wars movies, and it kind of focuses just a little tiny bit on potentially midichlorians if midichlorians are also part of a microbiotic world. Okay, so let's go ahead and get first off right into the news this week.
When I found you, I saw raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special.
So, first off, I think the most plausible rumor out there at the moment, and I actually see, this is news/rumor, but I do think this is more news and plausible. And I'm looking at Twitter right now, and there are several people that are retweeting my theory, and they kind of like it. So, a return of Lando Calrissian in Episode 9. There's been a lot of speculation about that. Today, even on the Reddit leaks page, apparently Billy D. Williams' son teased that Lando, for Episode 9, says he cannot confirm or deny anything. There's been quite a bit of talk that Billy D. Williams himself had been getting into shape. He was seen in Florida lately and talking about getting into shape. And it really does make all the sense in the world. I can buy why he wasn't in 7 and 8, especially 8, considering that we were focusing on this very singular story when it comes to the Resistance turning into another rebellion and then sending out the message to get those sympathetic to their cause to join, and of course they didn't. I tend to think that a part of 9 will be that Luke's sacrifice, if you will, in The Last Jedi will be the spark that lights the fire. Well, you know what? Poe just says it better than I do.
We are the spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down.
So it makes all the sense in the world that if Lando is brought back into the fight, especially if there is an absence of Princess Leia, that he would be in the movie. So I can absolutely see that. Now, Princess Leia, this was the other one, and I completely forgot about it. I didn't even have it in my notes. This was another one that was going around this week, and this is a rumor that's been out there for quite a while, and this is that Carrie Fisher would be recast in Episode 9, and the rumor popped up again this week that it would be Meryl Streep taking on the role of Princess Leia in Episode 9. The only reason why I think it's got any credence whatsoever is that Variety ran an article this week as well, and Carrie Fisher's brother said that he and the family would be fine with Carrie Fisher being recast in Episode 9 because they believe that Carrie Fisher would have wanted it that way. I've already made my statement on this, but I'll say it again. I have no issue with Carrie Fisher being recast and Princess Leia being recast. I do tend to agree that I think that Carrie Fisher would have wanted it that way. I have no way of knowing that for sure, but just watching all the interviews with Carrie Fisher throughout the years and how she looked upon her character and her role, it seemed pretty clear, just like it does with Mark Hamill, that they don't seem to have the same issue that so many toxic fans in the fandom do, where they claim ownership over Star Wars. It really seemed as if Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill both knew that these were characters written by somebody else that they kind of got on loan. And I mean this in absolutely no disrespect whatsoever. This is just a reality that I see. When it comes to maybe being taken out of the film, say Episode 9, in Meryl Streep, just for the lack of no other actresses being named. Let's just say it is Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep reprising Princess Leia, Princess Leia taking over for that role. It wouldn't for me because Carrie Fisher looked so different in The Force Awakens, and then even more different in The Last Jedi. There are some moments, especially at the end of The Force Awakens, where I can actually kind of see Carrie Fisher's sort of original trilogy, younger Carrie Fisher face. We all look different as we get older, and Carrie Fisher is no different. But she even looks very different from movie to movie, in my opinion. And I have a hard time seeing Carrie Fisher herself in her face. And again, that's not a dig at all. It's just, that's what happens. We all change. And so in that case, seeing somebody else portray Princess Leia that doesn't look like we're used to seeing Princess Leia, I don't particularly have any issue with that at all. And ultimately, it's for the story, right? If it ends up helping the story, then I hope that they would move forward and go ahead and recast for the sake of the story, regardless of what the fandom might think. And I think that's one of those things that the fans are going to get upset regardless, no matter what at this point in time. It's just the world that we live in. And let me stop here real quick because I totally forgot, and I'm going to do a disservice. And if the guys are listening, I'm going to feel really bad. So real quick, speaking of the fandom, I was on the Knights of Vader podcast this week. On Twitter, you can go to the KOV podcast, knightsofvader.podbean.com. I ended up recording a show with them on Saturday. Don't know how much of it they'll keep. It was almost 2 hours long. Had a chance to get on the line with Mark and with Zach and we did basically a deep dive into the fandom. And really spent a lot of time giving our opinions over where the fandom is right now. A lot of comments that I made on the show are similar things that I've said on this show, but they had some really interesting takes. Zach had some really good, Mark did too, but Zach had some really interesting thoughts about the fandom and the movies that I really appreciated listening to. I believe that's supposed to be out tomorrow, so that would be Thursday. I'm recording this on Wednesday. So if you want a little bit more Jon Justice and Star Wars, check out this week's, again, Knights of Vader podcast. It's on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Podbean, Spotify, iHeart, and knightsofvader.podbean.com, and you can follow those guys on Twitter at KOV podcast, and so you can go in and check that out. So, sorry, I lost track and didn't get a chance to mention it earlier, so there you go, and I'll, of course, give it another hit towards the end of the show. All right, moving on, some other news items. Tom Kane, who I believe did the voice of Yoda, he was on Clone Wars and Rebels, tweeted out that there were 9 movies in various stages of development. Star Wars movies, obviously. You know, I don't really have a ton to say about that because it depends on what your stages of development, is. I mean, we could break down, so 9, obviously, but that's in production, so does that count? Are we talking all 3 of Rian Johnson's potential films? Are we talking about 2 films or a trilogy from Benioff and Weiss, the Game of Thrones guys? Are you throwing, and I'm assuming we're talking about Obi-Wan Kenobi and a Boba Fett movie, but those haven't been officially announced, but those are supposed to be in various stages of production. So, I think for me, well, I don't think, I know, the biggest takeaway for me, and 9 movies in various stages of production means there's 9 movies in various stages of production, and that's a good thing. I feel like we've already moved past the Solo and the box office nonsense. We're already beginning to see some of the packaging. It looks fantastic for the Blu-ray release in September, which I cannot wait to get my hands on. I was even going to attempt to go see Solo one more time in the theater. May not be able to do that because I have family coming to town, but still wanted to do that. But I am excited to see that we're kind of moving past that and we're looking forward and not looking backwards and focusing sort of on any of the negativity related to Solo anymore. There was another rumor floating around. I have one more news item that we're going to have to spend some time on talking about, and then we'll get to the real rumor part of it. But J.J. Abrams was supposed to be on the James Corden Late Show this week, and he ended up being replaced at the last minute by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who played L7 in Solo. There was talk that we may be getting a title this week, and the conversation around an episode 9 title being released this week was coinciding with the 4-year-old being cast. I honestly don't know where those particular rumors started. I know that one YouTuber who puts out a lot of really bad clickbaity, fake, made-up stories reported it, and I'm not even going to say the individual's name. You know who I'm talking about. So if it originated there, then there's no credence to it whatsoever, but I feel like it started other places because people started tweeting it, and it was kind of all mixed up in this weird tweet storm that was taking place, and I do feel like they were 2 other things. I do feel like there was the rumors of 9, and then there was, which were kind of sketchy, if not totally sketchy, and then there was the larger something is coming. And I can't help but think, which is why I was kind of waiting, that we might get some news today on the Star Wars show here in a couple hours. But again, that remains to be seen. I do find it a little bit interesting, and it might have been that J.J. Abrams was supposed to appear on the James Corden show, and people figured they would be talking about Star Wars, right? But that didn't happen, which I think was odd that they ended up changing it. But let's be honest, that could be for any sort of myriad of reasons. Okay, so I'm going to set rumors aside for just a second, talk one more legitimate news item, and then we'll get into some rumors, and we'll talk a little bit about the essence of Star Wars, the iconography, what it means for the fandom, and the remaining time we have for the show this week. No listener feedback. I'm gonna save that for next week's show. So this week it's just gonna be me going blah, blah, blah about Star Wars. I do want to mention one thing. I want to thank friend of the show, Amanda, for sending me the information, and maybe you'd like to know, too, that the Disney Store has marked down a bunch of their Last Jedi toys. Disney makes some of the most fantastic sort of larger-scale diecast. Normally run about $20, and they've got them online for sale for $7.99, so I'm definitely going to be picking up Kylo Ren's TIE Fighter, and probably Poe Dameron's X-Wing, because I don't, I'm sorry, TIE Silencer, my bad, but also Poe Dameron's X-Wing, because I don't have that in that size yet. So I just wanted to thank a friend of the show, Amanda, for pointing that out. All right, so here's the one big news item that really got everybody talking this week. We'll spend a little bit of time on. George Lucas, okay? George Lucas shared his vision of what would have been for episodes 7 through 9. It comes from the At Insight Editions, the companion book to James Cameron's story of science fiction series on AMC. George Lucas is quoted as saying this: "The next 3 Star Wars films, we're going to get into a microbiotic world, but there's this world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them the Wills, and the Wills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force. If I had held on to the company, I could have done it, and then it would have been done. Of course, a lot of fans would have hated it, just like they did Phantom Menace and everything, but at least the whole story from beginning to end would be told." Okay. There's a lot of room for speculation in here, and I've heard a lot of the speculation. Let me throw in my 2 cents in what I think George was talking about. We already know that George had a specific idea for 7, 8, and 9. He was going to shoot 7 for sure, if it hadn't been for him selling the company. We also know that George had plans for Luke Skywalker. It's in the Art of the Last Jedi book that he was going to exile him as well. He even had temples, and there's artwork in the book where he talks about it. So that wasn't necessarily just J.J. Abrams' idea. So calm down, Last Jedi haters, or those that are mad that their Luke Skywalker headcanon didn't match. Sorry, I was going to be totally positive this week. Had to throw that in there. We also know that George had a plan to focus on sort of grandchildren, right? So younger age. Younger than what Rey turned out to be. A lot of people have been taking this, we're going to get into the microbiotic world, the world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them Wills. We see the Wills, we know the Wills, they already exist in the current canon, haven't gotten really into them, but certainly played a role in Rogue One with the Guardians of the Wills. What I think this is more along the lines of midichlorians. And I know a lot of people have speculated that we would see this world, and maybe we would, but that the movies would be focused on this, and it would be really kind of weird and trippy and bizarre. I don't think that's the case. I think what George is talking about here is something more akin to what we ended up getting in The Phantom Menace with the mentioning of midichlorians. You know, what are midichlorians? As midichlorians are off the chart, over 20,000. That's more than even Yoda. I don't doubt that George may have shown us a bit of this microbiotic world, but I think that it would have been a small portion of the overall trilogy in the larger picture of sort of the normal characters and the normal Star Wars that we're used to seeing. That's my takeaway from this. I think he's right. A lot of fans would have hated it. I didn't mind the midichlorians when you get into what they actually are and what they do. It doesn't bother me. I don't think it takes away from the mystique of the Force all that much. I do like the way that Rian Johnson handled it in The Last Jedi, right? Which is still George's vision, but I still like it that this is more of the energy, right? And surrounds us and binds us between all things. And inside, what do you see? A force, right? And that force is inside me. Powerful light, powerful darkness. I like that aspect of it without having to get into... I like it to be more spiritual, right? Spiritual. Than something that's more explainable or, using biology. So, look, I don't think there's any doubt that for a lot of us, we would have liked to have seen George's vision for those movies. I'm really beyond happy with what we're getting with this new trilogy. I think that when all is said and done for these 9 movies, we're going to have 3 very distinct trilogies. I've been watching the Movies with Mikey series on YouTube. The dude's fantastic. His stuff on Jedi, Force Awakens, and stuff about Star Wars is just, what it is about Star Wars that we love are just absolutely spot on. I love those videos. It's got a great comedic style. Really, really dug it and agree with almost everything that he had to lay out, apart from his frustration of the prequels. But that being said, the movies are very much a facet of the times. And the original trilogy was very much rooted in the 80s and special effects and pacing. The prequel trilogy was people trying to figure out what the CGI was and how that relates to movies and action. And then you get into the sequel trilogy, and I think that visually, the sequel trilogy so far is the most visually compelling and exciting of all the movies. I really do. That doesn't mean to that doesn't mean to say that there's not iconic moments and stuff that I love in all the other films, but I just say as a whole, I love seeing these fresh films. And that could just be the newness of it. We seem to gravitate towards newness. I know that I do, even with bands that I love, their newer music is the stuff because you're just not used to it yet. My opinion might change. And that aligns with my view of the Star Wars movies in and of themselves and why I don't rank them anymore. Because I love all of them the most at different times for different reasons. I'm a big believer that everything happens for a reason, and I think that it's a good thing that George Lucas sold the Star Wars to Disney and Lucasfilm to Disney, and I love what it is that they're doing with these films. And again, I think that it all happened for a very specific purpose, and so I'm very pleased by that. These are interesting thoughts, from George, and I do think that it's, I don't know. It's interesting when he goes and makes comments like that because you wonder how deeply involved it was and how much of it was just sort of penciled down. I heard somebody making a comment about that on the Steel Wars podcast. Making a comment about how, when George makes comments like this, you wonder how serious he actually was. All right, let's get into some rumor speculation territory, shall we?
I've seen this raw strength only once before. It didn't scare me enough then. It does now.
All right, so I'm just gonna go to the Reddit. To the Reddit leaks page, and we'll use the source as our starting point as we work through this. Okay, so on the Reddit leaks page, first you get this rumors suddenly flooding Twitter that a toddler has been cast for 9. Title is about to be announced. Okay, well that hasn't happened. Then there's this one, and this is interesting. So. It says, something is happening on Twitter. A bunch of game changers, developers, and other Star Wars community people are tweeting GIFs of very shocked and confused people with no context to what's going on. And it, Star Wars Explained tweeted something, but Star Wars Explained actually came out and said that they were just reacting to everybody else's tweets. Okay, and so you had sort of this confusion tweet from one particular individual, and then you had Ash Crossan, if you know who she is. My entire timeline is posting about news that doesn't even exist yet. They talk about, there's been a lot of hours and nobody's posted anything and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so there was all this stuff kind of going around, and where there's smoke, there's sometimes fire. Depends. Okay, so then you get to this, and this to me is probably the most legit thing, and I heard this on Steele Saunders' podcast. This is posted in the Reddit page, and the Reddit leaks page, and I'll just read you the quote, and then I'll give you my theory. Steele Saunders released his latest podcast. Towards the end of the episode, he addresses the cryptic rumor. He knows what it is. Jason Ward, making Star Wars, already let him in on the secret. And actually, Amanda Ward was on the podcast at the end. It's not mentioned in this. And she made a rather astute observation of, she thought it was interesting that the most ardent haters right now of Star Wars were the ones that seemed to be the most interested in whatever this big news might be without getting into it. She dodged it too. She obviously knows what it is. Steele said this: knowing what I know, all these people that have campaigned against Star Wars might get their way in the way they least want. All right, so this sparked a lot of speculation on Twitter. And so far, I haven't seen anybody mention what I'm about to mention. I have personally put it out on Twitter. And it sparked a lot of speculation, on the Reddit Leaks page. So, a lot of people talking about J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, and replacing him last minute. Okay, I thought that was interesting. So here was one thought. This is one thought that I had. Going off of Steele Saunders' comment, right? Again, people who have campaigned against Star Wars might get their way in the way they least want. And actually, now that I read it again, it makes me think that I'm actually right. Okay, so here was my first initial thought. That, especially with J.J. Abrams not ending up on the James Corden show this week, I thought that was interesting. I don't believe this anymore, but my first thought was that J.J. Abrams, for whatever reason, would not be shooting Episode 9, but that Rian Johnson would take over and his trilogy would be canceled. That was my original thought. The more I thought about that, though, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Ron Bergman just recently made the comment that they got about 2 years before their movie starts, before they start filming for their series of films. Okay, so he's already kind of commented publicly, and it doesn't quite align with what Steele said. Okay, and again, this is just pure speculation. Here's what I think it means. I think that Rian Johnson is going to do his trilogy in a brand new place with all new characters, but it's going to be based in the timeline that we formerly know as the EU and Legends of the Old Republic. When Rian Johnson was when it first was announced that he was going to do a trilogy, that's what we all thought, right? And that was the speculation, especially given what we know about The Last Jedi now. And the Force Tree and the Ancient Jedi text, and it seems to make sense because that would fit his aesthetic. We all kind of moved away from that because we had the Game of Thrones guys doing a series of movies, and so it's really easy to jump to, Benioff and Weiss, Game of Thrones, dragons, times of yore, right? And then go, well, that makes sense for sort of an old school, a long time ago beginning of the Jedi. But you think about that for a moment and you go, if you're the Game of Thrones guys, do you really just want to go and do Game of Thrones Star Wars? And I almost think that would be a bad idea because you wouldn't necessarily want your Old Republic Star Wars mirroring too much Knights, right? Knights of the, sort of Game of Thrones and medieval times. Sorry, I got lost on medieval times. And you think about what Saunders said. All those people who have campaigned against Star Wars. Who's campaigned most against Star Wars? If we look at that just directly, and I'm probably reading way too much into this, and when we find out what it is, which we probably will, I'm either going to look like a genius, having read directly into Steele Saunders and him being very literal, or I'm going to look dumb and it's not going to be anything close. But, the biggest campaign against Star Wars since Disney and Lucasfilm bought it has been the EU. It's been the bring back Legends, right? What worse thing would be for the fandom to get what they want in the Old Republic only to have Rian Johnson be the one to go and do it? And that kind of covers both of your bases. So that is my theory. All right, my theory is that Rian Johnson's trilogy, brand new story, right, based on brand new characters, but the timeline is the previous EU Legends Old Republic. Maybe we'll find out later today, and maybe there will end up being a brand new podcast talking about my sort of excitement over that possibility, because I think that's a great idea. If you're going to ask me where would you want Rian Johnson to do his trilogy, that's where I would want it to be. If anybody is going to do an Old Republic and, completely brand new, I think Rian Johnson would be the best person to pull that off, especially with the way that he tackled the mythology in The Last Jedi. I would really love to see that. So we will wait to see whether or not I am right. And of course, I'll take this moment to mention, I'd love to hear from you on all these different issues and speculation and Raylo baby and all that. Talkshownerd@gmail.com. Leave a comment on YouTube, and we'll certainly get into to all this and your thoughts on what's been laid out so far in the show on next week's show.
This is not going to go the way you think.
So, like I said, I'm going to keep the show somewhat shorter this week, just a normal standard, and I just show they've been going long, and quite honestly, I want to go play Battlefront. So, let's get into this. The essence of Star Wars, and I'll go back to what Steele Saunders said. I mean, it really is joy. I think a lot of what Star Wars encompasses is the mythology. It's the joy of it and the iconography. And I liked Solo a lot. I probably like Rogue One a little bit better. Just because it's grander in scope. You do get a little bit more of the mythology, injected into it with the Force. Mentioned this before of Jyn, on the ship before they arrive on Scarif, and they're going past the shield gate. I love that moment in the beginning, trusting the Force with their mom. And that's what I love about these films. I love just the depth and the mythology and the connections and emotion. I think emotion's attached to this too. Look, and the iconography is important. The iconography goes hand in hand with the nostalgia factor. And what we're used to seeing in terms of ships and in terms of framing of shots. I love seeing people go on Twitter and make comparisons to shots. I've seen the ones, Steele again talked about this, and it's just very fresh in my mind, which is why I keep bringing up the Steele Wars podcast. But he mentioned seeing a tweet where somebody had taken shots from the Dark Side Cave in The Empire Strikes Back in Luke, and had juxtaposed them next to the flashback scene, Luke and Kylo, and the moment of confrontation and how they mirror each other. I mean, there's so many moments like that within Star Wars. Again, the iconography. For those of us from the old original trilogy era, there is a lot of nostalgia about it that kind of drives the essence of Star Wars, and I think for future generations, it's going to continue to be the iconography of Star Wars. That can change, and George was very good at taking real-world things and putting a Star Wars spin on them, painting the TIE fighters that navy light blue that he did in The Empire Strikes Back to mimic the battleships, and having the Star Destroyers, actually originally being created out of with the very small details, of battleship kits, mashed up battleship kits, the lived-in world, and then going into the prequel trilogy and sort of pre-industrial era, the Naboo starfighter, right? Padme's ship in the Phantom Menace. It's modeled after an SR-71 spy plane, just made it chrome. There's just so much iconography, and it's going to mean something different for future generations moving forward. The nostalgia part of it for us will fade away. You'll have, I think, new nostalgia embedded in the younger generations, but as Star Wars continues to age and the fans begin to age and new fans emerge, I think that eventually, if it hasn't reached there already, somebody said that, Star Wars wasn't a franchise, it was a genre. It really is a genre. I think that it's going to end up becoming something more akin to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Not as it relates to how the movies are released and intertwined, perhaps, but in the way that we go and just, we want to go watch a new superhero movie. Yeah, let's go see a new superhero movie. And Star Wars will always benefit from, again, the iconography. I think if you're going to point to anything, it's just in my little commentary here. I think the iconography of Star Wars is driving at the essence of it, along with the joy and the fight between good and evil. Let's never, ever forget that. The fight between good and evil. The original trilogy was based off of relationships and families, right? Harrison Ford said it best, mommies and daddies. Those are things that we can relate to. The current story of Kylo and Rey, and the journey of discovery for the both of them. I mean, that's why I love it. That's why, one of the reasons why I love The Last Jedi. You know, here's Rey going to get Luke to bring him into this fight, but there's something more there, a bigger story. She has to go on her path and her journey of discovery, or else the rebellion has no chance. I mean, now I'm back on The Last Jedi and how great that movie is. Because it kind of threw me off at the beginning when, you know, I'm like, well, Rey is supposed to be recruiting Luke and bringing him back to the Resistance because his sister needed him to join the fight. And then you realize, no, man, this is bigger than that. Luke can't necessarily go out with a laser sword and face down the entire First Order. He does, but only through the power of the Force, and only to go and hand over that responsibility to the next generation in Rey. I mean, that's what this is about. The works of Joseph Campbell, deeply rooted in the psyche of all of us, that is passed on from generation to generation to generation. You know, you want to talk about joy, and I'll wrap the show up on this. Some of the shots, and I just wrote down a few. Rey on the Millennium Falcon in The Force Awakens, when she's heading for the back of the, all the shots of her, just, it's woman handling, but man handling the Falcon, for lack of a better word. I'm not trying to be sexist. I'm just, when she's throwing the joystick, right, the control stick, and slamming it to get the ship to turn. When she shuts it off so it falls, so that Finn can get that shot before she slams the throttle back down on it. And they punch out into space. Just, I mean, those moments, it's pure and utter joy every single time I see it. The beginning of The Force Awakens, when after the raid on the village, and you see Kylo Ren's shuttle flanked by the First Order transports as they fly past camera going to the Star Destroyer. Rey's scream during the Praetorian fight, when she does that just real slight, not obnoxious, totally believable twirl, and she's just, and she screams right before she goes and attacks that Praetorian guard. The entire Praetorian fight, for crying out loud. The shot of the ski speeder blasting through a wall of the red surface of Crate, flying up into the air. It's just, the screen is nothing but red, and the speeder just comes flying through. The Falcon busting up through the surface of Crate. And the shot almost slows down as it flies up, and it really is just the angle with the big chunks of red falling to the surface. I mean, there are no other films with shots like that get me, that just gut me the way that Star Wars does. And I could go and make a list from every single film of shots like that, regardless of things that we don't like, or moments of the film where we think the dialogue is clunky. It all just fades off into the distance, right? Like Luke would say, like a fleeting shadow. When you end up with an iconic moment that just always sort of takes your breath away, or at a bare minimum, just puts a big, huge smile on your face, right? Steele was right. The joy of it, for me, that's the essence of Star Wars. Just the pure and utter joy that it brings us. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. Back again soon, maybe sooner than we think, depending on if we get some big news. If not, episode number 129 again next week. Drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Leave a comment on YouTube. Check out the Knights of Vader podcast this week, knightsofvader.podbean. I joined them for a lengthy conversation. I had a really great time. I hope that you guys will check out their show, really enjoy their show. And I appreciated them inviting me on. That really, really meant a lot. You can find this show, YouTube, Spreaker, Stitcher, Podbean, iTunes, and I guess that's it. Have yourself a fantastic weekend, and I'll talk to you again real soon. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.